Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Sean Egan here from the FamilieSCN2A. We also have Gabby Conacher from the SCN8A Alliance. We're thrilled today to have Dr. Heather Olson and Catherine Salussolia. Did I butcher that? Apologize. From Boston Children's Hospital today to talk about the Praxis 562 study. They've now recently opened up an additional site at Boston Children's. So we wanted to host this panel to raise awareness about this clinical trial opportunity and also bring, a true KOL in the space available to you guys to answer any of your questions. But Heather has been, with our organizations for a long time. She was Mayo trained and is now faculty at Boston Children's. And she really knows epilepsy in and out as well as anybody in the world. So we're really thrilled to have you guys here. And maybe I'll turn the floor over to you, Heather and Catherine, to talk about this opportunity.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We have a team here, Dr. Salussolia, and we may be joined by Dr. Will Trout. We're all members of the epilepsy genetics team at Boston Children's Hospital and all involved in this clinical trial. So we're hoping today just to kind of give you an overview of what the trial is. I know that there's been discussion in both the SCN2A and 8A communities. This is Dr. Will Trout joining. And other sites have been open, but we are now officially open at Boston Children's Hospital. So I wanted to share with you and offer the opportunity to answer any questions. As Sean mentioned, I've been on the medical advisory board for FamilieSCN2A and follow patients in both cohorts, all three of us do. So we're here to help in every way that we can. So this trial is with Praxis, and the medication is Praxis 562. It's a small molecule, meaning it's a drug that can be taken either by mouth or by G-tube. It is in the category of a sodium channel blocker, but different than the currently available sodium channel blockers. The mechanism is slightly different. It targets more active neurons, and it targets something called the persistent current, which sounds like a fancy chemical word, but is a unique feature of the electrophysiology of these channels. SCN2A and 8A are code for sodium channels in the brain. So they help with electrical activity and management of connections for learning, as well as risk of seizures. And some of the currently available anti-seizure medications target the sodium channels, but it does target it in a different way. And that persistent current is a component of many of the variants, the disease-associated variants that have been established. So it's of interest, and at least in the animal data has shown more of a margin of safety with regards to being able to get to therapeutic levels with less side effects. This is the first study in children. It's a phase 2 clinical trial. Everybody will receive medication, but there is a randomization component that those randomized to placebo will have a 4-week period of placebo during the 16-week treatment study of the phase. The total study is about 24 weeks with a 4-week baseline period, 16-week treatment period, and then a 4-week safety follow-up, or the option to roll into an open label extension phase. And it will involve in relatively frequent visits. We can give you specific schedules for anybody who's more interested during the visit that will involve physical exams. You'll be tracking seizures at home in a diary, which is critical. The main outcome of the study is safety and tolerability. So how well do the kids tolerate the medication? But the secondary outcome will be measuring seizures and the change in seizures. And so the seizure diaries are really important, and there'll be some EEG data collected in the home as well between visits. So at Boston Children's, our current approval is for visits on site at Children's with travel provided, and we can help with any logistics there. We will be working on an amendment to have the decentralized component that you may have heard of, where they send a nurse and a physician to you, and our component is then more virtual. We're not open for that yet, but we'll be putting an amendment to get there, and the other sites are open for that. So happy to refer to additional sites as well. And for anybody interested, we should do whatever is most convenient for you and your family. So in this target specific specific members of the SCN2A and 8A community. So not every child with a variant in one of those two genes would qualify for this study. There will be other studies coming down the pipeline. And I'm happy to answer also questions on who may or may not be candidates for the study. For the 2A group, it's seizure onset under 3 years and a spelling change in the gene. For 8A, it's a little more broadly defined as SCN8A related developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. So that's kind of a broad overview. I know there's been questions that have come up about medications, and there's a limitation on other strict sodium channel blockers to one medication. So that's come up as a challenge to address for some of the individuals. And some of those things we may need to take on a one-by-one basis. And there are some other restrictions on medications, in particular for the anti-seizure medications. Rufinamide and cenobamate are contraindications for the study because of their impact on one of the heart intervals and risk of heart rhythm issues. So that may be more flexible if it's approved at some point, but for the study, they are exclusions. Catherine or Kim, did you want to add anything broadly before we tackle questions?
No, I think you covered it.
Yeah, I agree.
And you're muted.
Oh, sorry.
And you're muted. I think. I could hear you, Kim. Sean is muted. I could hear him see him trying to talk.
Apologize, and I have a lag connection too, so I think that's a double negative there. Thank you so much for the overview. Already getting a bunch of questions in, which is phenomenal. We'll start with one. My daughter is 8 months old. Can you explain why this medication and study is only for those 2 years of age and older? Can you maybe just walk through why that's an eligibility criteria and if there's any potential for that to change over time?
Yes, great question. So that is a pretty standard age range for initial clinical trials. It's mainly from a safety standpoint with regards to FDA, that most of the initial trials start at 2 years and up. There could be additional trials down the line that allow for earlier treatment, and or if it gets approved in pediatric neurology, we can use medications off label sometimes if the benefit outweighs the risk there. But 2 years is pretty standard for trials of anti-seizure medications across the board.
Thank you, Heather. How do we know which variants?
And I'm sorry that your child is too young at this point, but let's stay hopeful.
Absolutely. How do we know which variants will be accepted for this study?
So that we would review on a one-by-one basis. If it sounds like something that you would be interested in, you would reach out either to me or one of the other sites for a more detailed review of your child's situation, their variant, what medications they're on, and whether it looks like eligibility would make sense.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, for these trials, the eligibility criteria are really important to kind of get through the initial boundaries of the trial. And this drug is for gain of function, so that'll be one of the bigger criterias of gating for our communities.
You answered that a little bit more broadly for people too. The gain versus loss of function is not something that your clinical report tells you. It's not a clinical test that can be done. So there's only a subset of variants that have actually had functional testing in a research laboratory, and it's not a clinical test. So there are some that there's confidence about. There are others that we base primarily on the type of variant and the age of onset and overall clinical features of the epilepsy. And Praxis is actually being very cautious in doing some work on their own end with regards to variants and confidence that it is gain of function.
Thank you, Heather. My son is both SCN8A and SCN2A. Would they still be eligible for this study?
That is a great question, and we would have to look at the details of the variants in your son's presentation to look into that.
For patients who are enrolled in the study for 562, do they continue taking their current medication? And what happens if the medication is not approved? Can they still continue to take the medicine after the trial period boundaries end?
So the will need to have their medications at a point that is acceptable for the inclusion exclusion criteria, and then we need stability of the medications for at least 1 month before the trial were to start. They would absolutely continue taking their baseline medications and would need to agree to maintain the same doses, barring an emergency situation that we would decide something different, but we ask for medication stability throughout the trial, except for rescue medications in that situation.
The
So they
only-
would continue taking their baseline as long as we get them to the point that they qualify. Yes, Catherine.
And that's what I was gonna just say, in terms of to be able to qualify, you can only be on one other sodium channel blocker. So if you have 2 on at this point, you would need to wean off of one and be at that steady state for at least a month prior to the trial.
Which would need to be an individualized and careful discussion with your physician managing epilepsy.
If that is something that, people's regular neurologist needs some help kind of working through that process and protocol, if that's something that Boston Children's can help with or make recommendations on the most appropriate wean.
Yes, for anybody looking to enroll, I'd be happy to communicate with the neurologist and without an official visit, can't provide official medical advice, but I can always talk to a physician and kind of brainstorm with them.
Is this trial US only? And yeah, maybe we'll start there.
This trial is not US only. Let me bring up the sites.
There's a site in Spain as of right now.
Thank you, Celia. Celia is our coordinator for the study. Appreciate that.
Everyone.
I believe that the Europe is decentralized as well, with the exception of Britain. With Brexit, I think that they don't have sites at the decentralized capacity there. And I think I'm interpreting this question right, but maybe people living in the US that are not a US resident, are they eligible to apply for the study in Boston Children's?
Potentially, there are some nuances with international situations, so we'd have to discuss that on a one-by-one basis.
Is there an association with zonisamide as an exclusion criteria? I think you mentioned 2 drugs that had drug-to-drug interactions, but maybe could you repeat those?
Which medication were they asking? Oh, zonisamide?
Mhm.
So zonisamide is not an exclusion, no, and it's not on the list that's considered a strict sodium channel blocker, if I'm remembering correctly. There are several of the anti-seizure medications that sort of have mixed function, and the sodium channel component is part of that. So zonisamide, valproic acid, those are not being considered in the strict one only category. Again, it's going to be important to look at the overall profile of your medication list for each individual child to think about whether they're in a good place to add an additional sodium channel blocker at that point, but it's not an exclusion as far as I'm aware. I can do a double check in the background.
Thank you. Someone asking if they're not sure if they're gain or loss of function. Is it best just to kind of call, enroll, and have you guys take a look at the individual?
Necessarily enroll, but we can do some sort of pre-screening and help people figure that out.
Is there a website at Boston Children's to pre-screen for the study, or how is it best for patients to consider that?
There is not a website, but there is contact information for the study. So I'm trying to bring up your flyer here.
Yeah, you can email me. I can also put my email in the chat if that is allowed.
Yeah, I don't think we have a problem with that.
Am I allowed to share the screen? I will share the screen here too. So this is our flyer, which we're happy to send out to anybody about the study. It's called the Unfold Study, and this is Celia's contact information. She's our primary coordinator, and there will be obviously coverage otherwise if she's not available, but she'll get it to the right people in our team.
Thank you. What is the estimated regulatory milestone, and when can we expect this to be commercially available? Maybe you could just talk from a high level, from phase 2 until market, what are kind of the barriers and what the drug has to show?
Sure, sure. So a phase 2 is looking at safety and tolerability of the medication. If it looks like a safe medication, and continues to look promising, the next step would be a larger, what's called a phase 3 study, which would enroll. So this study is a total of 20 patients, combination of 2A and 8A, whereas a phase 3 study would be on the order of 100 patients or more typically. And then you need to show that the medication is leading to benefit in reduction. Usually reduction of seizures would be the primary outcome measure. And so we're looking at least a 5 to 10 year probably timeline to clinical availability if it's proven to be efficacious.
Thank you, Heather. So maybe from a high level too, for a lot of us, this is kind of our first exposure to clinical trials. Maybe could you help, like when you're talking with your patients, how do you discuss kind of the risk reward of clinical trials? What are the benefits, and how do you help caregivers think through that equation?
That's a great question. So it's very individualized. It depends on the goal of the patient. I think, if seizures are controlled and quality of life is great, you're probably not going to be thinking about clinical trials, and you're probably not going to meet the inclusion criteria for clinical trials. For individuals whose epilepsy is tough to manage, which is often the case with these disorders, it's a balance between what are your options left clinically and how strongly do we feel that they will help you or won't help you. And it's sort of a calculation of willingness of risk, what your child you think they would tolerate. There is hope, and we are very hopeful that this medication will be better, but it's not an established medication. It is a clinical trial, and so nobody knows if it's going to be better than what's available out there today. And so it's a question of families' interest in trying something new with the hope of something better, balanced with what the risks might be. And we can talk about individual risk here. This is a well-established class of medications, so we don't anticipate challenges well outside that class of medications, and we can have an educated conversation there. But it is ultimately a new compound as well. And logistics come into big play. So what does it take for your family to be able to involve in the trial? The decentralized component that's available at other centers, not yet at our center, adds some flexibility in being able to do things at home, and hopefully we'll have that down the line as well. There are some benefits to having travel paid to come to a center too, and if there are other clinical things or other research opportunities that you're interested in participating, that's something that may be a benefit to you for additional clinical insights or input. So it comes down to kind of logistics of what would be involved, how interested are you in participating and contributing to advance knowledge in the field, and then the opportunity for something that may end up being more efficacious in getting it earlier versus the potential risks.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. So I think the one thing that's unique about Boston Children's is that there is an in-person portion of it versus the decentralized. Maybe could you talk through the value add of being able to go to Boston Children? Any additional resources that are provided from more eyes actually on the patient, or what are the differences between those two different scenarios?
So we always love getting to see people. I think we've gotten used to the virtual world since the pandemic. But even with people that I know well, I think there's a lot to be gained from a face-to-face conversation, an opportunity to be had there, as well as doing the exams ourselves and feeling really confident about what we're seeing. We have experience with this population. We have a well-established epilepsy genetics center, as well as we can pair it with clinical visits. If you're interested in clinical visits, we get to sit down and chat and usually have a little bit of extra time if there are questions not directly related to the study. The visit obviously is focused on the study, but if there are other things that you wanted to accomplish at Boston Children's or in the area, it gives that opportunity. And I think really more than anything, that interpersonal interaction is hugely valuable if it's something that you feel like you and your family are able to do.
Maybe just adding a quick tangent on that. I had the opportunity to, go to Boston Children's this year over the summer and visit with Dr. Olson and her team. And we love our neurologists, and our current clinical team. But Dr. Olson and team have identified a few things with our daughter Harper that, wasn't on our radar. So that extra clinical visit and getting more eyes on site has been, instrumental for helping my family and my daughter. So I think there's a lot of value of like setting up those extra visits and maybe identifying other things that maybe are early and aren't really presenting, but having these experts be able to give you that additional insight is really helpful.
If you were interested, we could enroll you in our we have an epilepsy genetics observational study too, where we're collecting information about 2A and 8A. We have a general epilepsy genetics cohort, so really both populations, the phenotype only component that we'd have you in our database. We can coordinate with the scientists who are studying functional impacts of variants, as well as some of the observational studies that we're doing. So if that's of interest, you can offer that as well.
Sure. One question here on eligibility criteria. Could you talk about like the number of seizures that a child has to have in order to be eligible for the trial?
Yep. So that, again, you're going to need a detailed discussion of the exact kinds of seizures that your child is having, as well as the frequency, because it's a little bit more nuanced than just a straightforward number. So it's not something that we necessarily put on our recruitment flyers, but it is the inclusion exclusion criteria are explicitly listed on clinicaltrials.gov, where all of the available clinical trials are listed. So the baseline is at least 8 motor seizures in a 4-week period, but there's specific definitions for the kinds of seizures. And so whether or not you think your child would qualify, it may be worth a discussion if it's of interest to you.
Someone asking, is there still the opportunity to have a fully decentralized clinical trial if you're ex-US? Can you comment on that?
For ex-US, it depends on where ex-US. They do have the site in Spain, so we could look into the range of where they're able to recruit. So the short answer is yes, but we'd have to look into the logistics of where you are and what would be feasible.
Just reading through this one right here. Okay. Is it possible? Do you know how long the screening period is going for, or are you able to give any kind of general guidance of how long screening and enrollment for clinical trials go for?
So that can be highly variable. They are wanting to be pretty aggressive with our timeline for enrollment. So our initial timeline is to try to identify patients who are interested in moving forward by the end of the month. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to see you for your first visit in that timeline if we need to wean medications. And that may or may not change. So if you're interested, reach out and we can work on timelines and what would work.
Perfect. For any individual that's never kind of been a part of a clinical trial, maybe could you walk through what that experience looks like from kind of pre-screening to enrollment, informed consent, and then like what the actual visits and treatment looks like?
Sorry, I was reading one of the questions. Do you mind repeating?
Yeah, absolutely. For individuals that haven't been a part of a clinical trial in the past, maybe can you walk through what that experience looks like from pre-screening, informed consent, and then actually starting the study and what those clinical visits look like?
So pre-screening is just a conversation either by phone or Zoom, or possibly gathering medical records to take a look at whether we think the child qualifies. If we think they would qualify, after we have all the information, we would determine if anything needs to be done to get them to the point of ready for pre-screen. And most of the time that would involve stabilizing medication, stabilizing keto diet, stabilizing VNS, vagal nerve stimulator. and set up a screening visit, which for our site would be in person at Boston Children's Hospital. We would see the child, do an exam, do an EKG, baseline blood work. And then there would be the 4-week period of a baseline, and they would come back and get their first dose of medication while they were on site with us. The randomization to placebo versus drug happens in the background when they come for that second visit. And we provide them with medication, and then they have, and you would get a specific schedule of assessments, but it's every kind of let me bring up the specific schedule here, but it's every sort of 2 to 6 weeks, depending on where you are in the phase of the trial. Talia, do you the total number of visits? Do you want to look at that? I meant to count that up and I
Yes.
didn't.
There's about 10 visits, and they're all by like 2 weeks. The last 2 visits are 4 weeks apart.
So 10 visits during that time period of
About
24
4
weeks that I
months,
mentioned.
if that helps.
And the pacing of visits slows down significantly in the open label extension phase if you choose to continue.
Part B is 16 weeks, or like it's 4, 4, 4, 12 weeks apart. So you only come into Boston Children's 4 times a year.
It is for clinical trials really important that we actually get you there. And so we absolutely understand that kids get sick and end up in the hospital and various other things. And it's sort of a case-by-case situation that we work out what we need to do, or flight cancellations or whatnot. But we work with you, we work with our travel vendors, and make sure that we get those visits accomplished within window.
I think one of the questions here, how long might it be before a larger phase 3 might open for this trial? And I can talk on that too if you don't have any guidance on it.
I don't know that I can give a specific guideline. If you want to give kind of an overview, let me know. Or
Sure. So the first part is you'd have to wait for this clinical trial to read out to the primary endpoint. So that's essentially where the trial ends and open label extension begins, which I believe is 12 weeks. Is that correct? So it'd be 12 weeks after the last.
It's a 16-week
16-week study. So it'd be 16 weeks after the last patient enrolled into the trial. But then after that trial reads out, the sponsor tends to have to gather all the data together and then go to the FDA in order to have a conversation of what a phase 3 looks like. That tends to be about 6 to 8 months from kind of data end and initial data readout for the study, and in order to have those conversations and design the phase 3 trial. But there is a lot of variability there from sponsor to sponsor and study to study. For kind of smaller, rare diseases like this, a lot of times the sponsor can have a pretty good idea of what the trial looks like already. But a lot of times the data out of these phase 2 studies really kind of guides how big and what the next stage of the trial would look like. So a lot will depend on how quickly this trial enrolls, and then how quickly the sponsor is able to get all the data together and talk with the FDA. You mentioned the open label extension a few times. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about what that is for individuals in our community.
Sure. So everybody undergoes the initial phase of the study, and in this particular study, everybody gets drug except for half the group won't get drug for a 4-week period, somewhere in that 16-week period. And then you have the option at the end, and you don't have to decide at the beginning of a study. When you finish that initial phase, you can decide whether you want to roll into that open label extension phase, during which everybody gets medications. They would need to continue to come for visits, but much less frequently. And we'd continue to collect safety data. So you'd still be working closely with our team, but you'd have the option to continue medication. There are a specific number of weeks that are defined, but the idea is that usually it's long enough that we get to the point of knowing whether or not the drug will continue.
Thank you, Heather. So maybe kind of distilling that down, the open label extension is like a period after the study. The decision on the kind of the research portion of the study, the main part is over, and it gives you the ability to be on study drug, hopefully either until it's commercialized and commercially available, or we know that the drug isn't working, and then it's probably appropriate to stop usage there.
And you can stop at any point during that period. You don't have to continue if you enroll in the open label extension. And it also has more flexibility in changing other medications is an important point. In the initial study, you have to stabilize the other medications, but during the open label extension, you're allowed to change other anti-seizure medications. One important note with regards to other studies, and I know Sean had brought up that this is a question that came up. For clinical trials in general, there's usually an exclusion of being on another investigational agent. So doing the study does not in any way prevent you from doing other clinical trials, but continuing on an investigational agent may be an exclusion for other clinical trials. So you may have to make a decision. How much benefit am I getting from this? Do I want to come off and try something new, experimental, versus continue this and wait to see what happens with the other agent?
Thank you, Heather. And for our 2A community on here, I think the washout period for this drug, which is a small molecule, is pretty quick. So how quickly the drug's out of your system and how long before you can potentially enroll into a different trial is relatively short. The other therapeutic that is specific to SCN2A is 222, which is an antisense oligo, and the washout time for that drug is quite a bit longer. So if you're thinking through kind of like, we know we want to be in clinical trials, which one do we try first? Starting on 562, and then that gives you a quicker time span of being able to get off this drug and try the other one if you think that's right for your family. My child is growing rapidly and is requiring frequent dosing changes. You mentioned that for the study that drugs have to be constant. How do you navigate that as a clinician and within the study?
Great question. So the initial study being a 16-week period, which is about 4 months, we generally, from a growth standpoint, for children 2 and older, wouldn't need to adjust medications if that's a concern. Again, we can have a conversation with that child's neurologist, but we would want to keep the same doses of the other medication just for that initial study period. And then once it's open label, it's okay to change medications.
Thank you.
It's more than 16 weeks because of the baseline and the safety follow-up, but from baseline to open label is 20 weeks.
You mentioned that the molecule.
The one thing I would add there is that during the study, they are going to be doing blood work and monitoring and also taking levels of medication. So especially since this is a affects sodium channels, and if you're on another sodium channel blocker, they'll be monitoring to see if anything needs to be adjusted, if there's like any possible side effects. So while your meds should be stable, they might be adjusted slightly during the study itself as needed because of the fact that there may be 2 sodium channel blockers on board.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't mention that. That's unique to this study, that there's a safety mechanism built in case you're getting side effects from too much sodium channel blocking, that in collaboration with the PI, the site PI, can lower the other sodium channel blocker. Thank you, Catherine, for bringing that up.
You mentioned that the 562 is oral. If a child has a G-tube, are they still eligible? How does that work?
G-tube is okay.
G-tube and J-tube, both are okay.
Clinical trials can sometimes be a little bit scary for a parent and caregiver. You mentioned that this class of drug is pretty well known. What things are looked at, and how should we be thinking about safety from a parent and a caregiver perspective?
So we would go over a lot of detail about that if you're in the consent process of the study, but the sort of key side effects, we're monitoring the heart because sodium channel blockers can have impacts on the kind of intervals in the heart and risk for rhythm problems. So the EKG would be monitored closely. The more typical side effects would be sedation and balance issues, kind of being the key ones. So alertness, interaction, sedation, things that you would recognize in your child and we would address if they came up.
That makes sense. You mentioned 20 people are enrolling for that study. After those 20 are enrolled, does the study stop, or how does that work? Can they keep enrolling?
It would stop enrollment at 20, and that's across all sites. And then we would wait for the information before a larger study.
For any individuals that don't live in the Massachusetts area, can they still participate in the Boston Children's study, and how would that work?
So yes, if you're willing and able to travel to us, we would be happy to see you, and there are reimbursements for travel, and we can work with you on whether that's plane, train, car, whatever route is best for your family. We can figure that out.
I love it. For the clinical sites, is there any cost to the patient or insurance considerations?
There are no costs associated with the study. You will get reimbursements for travel and some, I believe, meal coverage. So I can talk to the specifics of what gets paid back, but we make sure that you don't have additional costs associated with coming for the study.
Do the patients find,
If you're doing clinical visits along with that, we'd have to look in, that is not covered under the study for actual clinical visits. So we'd have to work with our clinical team and administrative support to check into insurance coverage and what any copays may be. But for the research study, there are no costs.
Thank you. You mentioned oh, go ahead.
Sorry, there's like accommodation, per diem meal, air travel, and mileage reimbursement.
You mentioned that Boston Children's also has observational studies. Someone's asking, can you explain a little bit more about what those are?
So first thing I'll say is go to the FamilieSCN2A and the SCN8A Alliance for their observational studies, because the larger studies are posted on their websites, and those would be the first things to enroll in. We have some broader epilepsy genetics studies through children's that for patients that we see in our program, we can offer enrollment in, either because we're looking for genetic explanations, or in this situation, it would be more for having you enrolled to participate in any of our efforts. So we're working with a couple of the groups that are doing functional analyses, and it gives us ability to kind of share de-identified, meaning not sharing any names or date of birth or anything along those lines, information on clinical picture and variants. So those are the kind of studies that I'm referring to. It allows us to do some clinical research as far as understanding what these disorders look like and what their functional impacts are, collaborating with other groups.
How do we bring up, the idea of this study or clinical trials in general with our neurology, our home neurology team? Like, what's the best way to bring up the idea, and how do we effectively communicate, that with our neurology team?
So if you're interested, especially given a relatively short timeline towards finding out if you want to do the study or not, I would suggest that you reach out to your neurology office, whether they use an electronic portal or a phone, and say, hey, I heard about this study. Is it possible to set up a visit or a virtual visit, or have a phone call to have a conversation about whether it's relevant for my child and what it would take to get there? You can also put them in touch with us. I can put in, oh, this is only for hosts and panelists. Sean and Leah can get you my direct contact information as well. So Leah's was shared already, but you can certainly contact me too. I'm not great with email, so please reach out through our team. If I don't reply to you, it's not because I'm ignoring you.
I think we're kind of getting to the majority of the questions that we had paneled up. Are there any other things that are important for our patient community to kind of consider for this study, in your opinion?
I think we've covered the bullet points. The other thing I would say is this is amongst the first clinical trials in these communities. And so I think being able to rally and show support for clinical trials is only going to help the community with regards to other pharmaceutical companies being interested and wanting to work with the community. So I think that's something that is relevant to consider. It doesn't mean that you as an individual family are, it's a individualized decision as to whether it makes sense for you to enroll. And I don't want to feel anybody to feel pressure to be included, but I think that's kind of a big picture aspect. But it's also, if there are questions about logistics of clinical trials or whatnot, no question is too big or too small. So feel free to reach out.
Perfect. We actually kind of got a handful of more questions. So terrific. Thank you for all the questions, everybody, as well. My child currently doesn't have motor seizures, but is getting regular EEGs for ESIS. Is that something that the child would be eligible for the study?
Good question. So yes, this continuous spikes in sleep, and that would not, if there aren't clinical seizures, it wouldn't qualify for the current trial, but it's certainly worth keeping in mind down the line.
And is there a time limit on when it must be fully enrolled, this trial?
I don't have a strict timeline on that. It's a moving target. So I would say if you're interested, reach out, but in the next few weeks, we'll kind of know more as to where they are with the total enrollment.
Thank you. I got one more here. Maybe can you talk about why these studies are important for, like, why can't a drug just be commercially available, and why these studies are needed for research?
Great. So it is really important before we give a drug to a lot of people to have strict observation. When we do treatment in clinics, there's some variability in what data is collected and how we collect it. And so it's not scientifically rigorous, whereas doing a formal clinical trial gives us really rigorous information on the safety and eventually the efficacy of these medications. So we want to make sure that what we're using, especially once we start using it broadly, is helping our patients and not hurting our patients. And if we only rolled that out clinically, there are things that would get missed.
Can you talk about the assessments we should expect to be completed at each visit?
So the main things would be physical examination, EKG, which is stickers on the chest to check the heart rhythms, plus or minus urine. There might be a couple of blood draws because they're doing something called PK analysis, which looks at the change in the levels of blood over time. So during some of the visits are a little longer to do, test the blood at different times. And then there are a couple of simple surveys that we would, in kind of scales that we have you fill out. That's all very detailed in the informed consent form that gives you kind of a broad overview of the sorts of things that you'd be doing.
Thank you. You mentioned informed consent a few times. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah. So the informed consent is making sure you know all the details about the study, who's doing it, what's involved, very detailed kind of what's involved from a kind of visit to visit standpoint, talking about potential risks, talking about protection of private medical information, who information is shared with or not shared with, contacts for our study team, and then officially kind of signing that this is something that you feel is in your child's best interest, and want to sign them up for. If the individual is of the ability that they're able to provide input in that, and say for themselves if they want to participate in the trial or not, there's something called assent that we get from the child to say, yes, I want to participate as well.
Do you have a sense of how long each of the visits are, for a family coming into Boston Children's for one of the visits throughout the trial? How long should they expect to be on site? And what do those days kind of look like?
So we will outline that for you in more detail. Some of the visits will be shorter and some of the visits will be longer, depending on the timeline of how we need to get things. So anywhere from, I would anticipate at least a few hours, sort of 3 to 4 per visit. So it's a good portion of the day when you come to see us.
Can I just add something to that? There are some blood tests that we're doing post the visit, like post dose. And so those are 6 hours post dose. And so you definitely would be in a hospital for at least 6 hours in certain visits. with those specific blood tests.
Yeah, that's why I refer to some of the longer visits. So if we're not doing those kinds of things, more on the order of a half day, but if we're doing the longer blood draw intervals, it can be up to a full day.
Those days, are you in the ER the entire time, or where, or are there different places within Boston Children's that we would have to go to?
So that we have a clinical trial study unit. It's not the emergency room, so it's not a crazy place with people filled who are sick. People are in the unit are generally healthy and coming for study visits. And you'd have your own room. There would be breaks in between things, and you can leave the unit at times to go down to the cafeteria or whatnot, depending on what we're doing and whether you have lines in place. But they're definitely, we make sure that we build in some break times, snack times, that sort of thing. But the main place that you would be located is in the clinical trial study unit, which is between our outpatient building and our inpatient building, and has its own sort of dedicated.
Thank you. We got one here. Do we know what the
main hospital building that is connected to the inpatient and outpatient aspects of the main Boston Children's site?
Thank you. Are any patients already enrolled, or have they been dosed? And what are the current status of enrollment?
At Children's, we just had our site initiation visit, so we don't have anybody enrolled yet. We're in the process of recruitment. We've talked to a few families who have expressed interest and are working through details there, but we haven't enrolled anybody at our site yet. Other sites have.
We're getting to kind of the winter months, at least in the Northeast here in the US, where colds and whatnot are going around. How do we navigate kind of getting a cold with our children? Is there like a contact person at Boston Children's we would contact if we were in the study, and how would those type of things be managed?
So you'd be in very close contact with our team. Saleha, who's on here, is our main coordinator. So she'd be the main point of contact for logistical issues. We have a number of other coordinators on our team who would serve as backup if we do let her take vacation days. You'll have contact numbers for our team, and I also have a clinical research pager that either I or Dr. Wilchild or Dr. Salussolia would make sure is covered at any time for emergency situations, whether that's your suddenly have a fever and can't make it and we need to rearrange things, or for monitoring, we monitor what's called adverse events. So if you end up in the hospital for other reasons or whatnot, it's important that you let us know quickly, especially if it's something severe, so you'll be able to reach out to us at any time.
Thank you, Heather. Will you reach out to 2A and 8A families who are possibly eligible, or should families be direct outreaching to you guys?
We are going through what kind of lists and databases we have to reach out to families if they agreed to being reached out to for other reasons. We've made sure that all of our epilepsy physicians at Children's are aware, but I wouldn't wait for us to reach out. If it's something that you feel like you're interested in and want to know, please do contact us.
You started off talking about why this drug is a little bit different than kind of the current medications. Like, what are like the theoretical benefits of this class of medications? Would it be seizure improvement or quality of life, or whatever? What are the theoretical benefits of better sodium blocking?
Great question. So what we'd be looking at first, as far as what impact it's having, is with regards to seizures. So controlling seizures. That's what sodium channel blocking medications have been approved for in the past. Other sodium channel blockers with slightly different mechanisms. So seizures are number one. We are, the hope is that it may have impacts that are broader than that, either because we're controlling seizures or just because we're regulating that sodium channel activity better, and that may have positive benefits for development and behavior. We don't know that to be the case. That we probably still won't know whether that's the case or not, even after our phase 3 trial that's targeted with the primary outcome of seizure management, but it's something that we'll learn more about over time if it moves forward.
I think one of the unique things about, newer differentiated blockers is like the potential to be able to get off of other medications. I think a lot of our, at least in the 2A community, a lot of our gain of function are on 3 or 4 sodium channel blockers. Can you maybe speak to like if you get good control with one sodium channel blocker, what are the benefits of being off of 3 or 4 others at the same time? Maybe kind of like an indirect benefit of the therapy just from being off so many other sodium channel blockers.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the main thing we're hoping for is that if you can be better controlled on one medication, you can minimize side effects from whether it's high dose of one other sodium channel blocker or multiple sodium channel blockers kind of can have additive effect for those side effects that we're talking about, the impact on cognition and alertness and balance, coordination, all those things, and even GI upset to some extent. If you can be on medication that has more efficacy and less side effects and off of medications that have more side effects, that hopefully would be better.
Terrific. If we're not quite 2 years of age yet, but we're getting there soon, can we call and reach out now, or should we wait until our child is at 2 years of age?
Yeah, absolutely reach out. Kim and Catherine, please do jump in on any of these questions if you have other things to add. We're doing kind of rapid fire questions, but I don't have to be the only one.
We've gone through a lot of questions in a short period of time. It's been phenomenal. We really appreciate it. And Gabby just shared a recorded session with Praxis if you're interested in learning more about the science behind 562. Maybe I'll pose any last round of questions. If anybody has any more, please submit those in the chat. But I think we've gotten through most areas of this drug in this clinical trial. Maybe we'll give it
one. Just to add that our team is happy to help, even if you don't end up coming to our center and end up enrolling at one of the other sites. We are, invested in helping make this happen in whatever way. So if you, for whatever reason, feel more comfortable talking to us, we're happy to answer questions and make sure you get where you need to go.
Well, I want to thank each of you for your time, really considerate for, kind of taking rapid fire questions. Dr. Olson, it's really appreciated, and each of you for your time today. I think Leah also said thank you, and same with Gabby. But I think that's it for questions. But for the community, if anybody has any additional questions, we'll share the contact information. You're free to reach out to them independently or us, and we can take your questions and try to get you answers as well. But thank you everybody for your time today, and really appreciate everything.
I encouraged everybody to act quickly. Just as an FYI, I'm out of the country next week for a meeting, but Catherine and Kim are here, and I'll be on email intermittently. So just wanted to give that heads up. We have a team.
Thank you, Dr. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, everybody, for taking time to join.
Take care and safe travel next week.
Thank you.